Hey, man!
Watch out! It's a woodpecker from space!
For this pose, I'm going to be using PoseSpace. PoseSpace is a really good website for sculptors because you can search for all sorts of poses, and I'll show you just an example. So let's say if I wanted this pose would be a really excellent pose for sculptors because it's a kneeling pose, very simple. And then for this sort of sculpture, you do not need an armature because, especially for water clay, because it's kind of like a triangle, 2 feet, 2 legs on the ground, and you can just kind of build it up. They even have a nice detail of the face. So this is a pose I was considering doing, but I think I'll probably do this afterwards. And this kind of like viewer is nice because you can just kind of move it around like this. The reason this one is a little bit more difficult is because there's only this contact point on the ground, and then on the other side, on this side, you have just a tippy toe. I mean, this makes it a very elegant sculpture, but it is a little bit harder to balance, but you can do it. It's definitely doable. PoseSpace is by far the best sculpture reference I found for figure artists. And these are my library of poses that I bought. And I just downloaded the pose that I'll be working on. This is the pose I selected from posespace.com. The model is named Alicia, and I've used her before in several sculptures. But the reason I picked this one is because it's almost, when you think of composition in a sculpture, it's always good to have this sort of composition. It's a triangle, if you can kind of look at it this way. There's a lot more of the bottom part touching the base, and what that means is that it's going to be a lot easier to compose the sculpture without any armature. You have to determine if you want to sculpt the hair, and I probably will sculpt the hair because it does look nice, but it's going to give you some very difficult things. It would be nice if PoseSpace had the model pose without the hair, because then you get to choose if you wanted to keep the hair in the sculpture or not, but that's something that you might want to do. But in that case, if you want to sculpt the back without the hair, you need to understand a little bit more about anatomy. For this sculpture, you're going to need, of course, your modeling stand and some tools. You'll need some wooden tools like this. These are really good for general modeling. And usually in the back, you'll have this is the more serious part, at least I like it, because you can kind of make concave sort of modeling, and this is what I'll be using. You can get like a set of these on Amazon. They're like $12, made out of hardwood. They work really well for water-based clay. I do like this one. It's got a nice flat edge. So, one of the things I try and do is make sculptures geometric, and that's the way I do it. So this is what the wooden tool kind of looks like. You can see it's curved, and that really helps the modeling. And it's a recent thing I've been doing, using this kind of scooping edge, but it really helps out. So get yourself some wooden tools, because wooden tools work really well with water-based clay. Another really important tool are these kind of serrated tools, and they have like little bits in here. So when you brush over your sculpture, you'll create these patterns, but that's just a very good way of removing unwanted superficial things. And it's not about the texture itself, but the texture helps you see much better the form. You need a serrated tool like this, a wire tool, and this one's really good. On one side it doesn't have the teeth, and on the other side it's got the teeth. I use the teeth quite often. Another very important tool is this. This is just a paint scraper, and I use this quite a bit. You can get this at Home Depot, and starting out, you're going to use this quite a bit. Another really good tool to use is just simply a knife. Some of the best tools are the simplest. And this one's got the serrated, so it'll create a texture when you're running it through the clay. Now there are these wire tools that you can get. They just have like a wire running through this round wire. I honestly don't think these are as good as these. These are so much better than these. And you can see I haven't really used it too much, but you can get this from Sculpture House. And Sculpture House has got just really good stuff. Towards the end of the sculpture, you're going to use some bristle brushes like this. Bristle brushes are very good for water-based clay because you can get into sections of your sculpture with them that you otherwise would not be able to get to if you were to just use your fingers, because your fingers are like bigger. Another wooden tool I like to use, and you can see this one is already, it's been used and abused. I got like a little bit of a chip on one side that kind of definitely limits the amount of modeling I can do, but I use it quite often, and that is what you want. You want this sort of shape for sculpture, especially for water-based sculpture. The way this kind of is shaped will definitely make sculptures a lot easier to do, and this is your modeling tool, so this is probably the one I use the most. Now you can get this at a pottery store, and it's just like a flat piece of aluminum with edges here, and you can use this just to kind of like scrape, and you can use the backside to create a very flat plane. These are just some of the tools I'll be using, and you know, sometimes I'll just grab something else that I think will make the most sense, but I find that this is pretty much all you need for most sculptures. You don't need like 400 tools to do a job. You can just rely on these very simple tools. Water-based clay, you're going to need a water bottle for spraying water because your water clay gets dry, and this is the way you keep it moist. You don't want to use the modeling stand as your base. What you're going to need is a base for your sculpture. The base that I'm going to be using, I've used this before, as you can tell. It's just a wooden base, and I put a plastic bag on it so the clay doesn't really get through to the wood. You don't need to do that. If your base is this material, like this laminated thing, you don't need it. This one's a little bit different because I use this for standing sculptures because I got this pipe here, and then I got these like 3 prongs here. If you want to learn more about this sort of sculpture armature, it's not really an armature, sculpture stand. Just look at my video of doing the standing figure sculpture, and I use this. This goes into the sculpture and it kind of holds it a little bit. This is the wire tool that you're going to need. All you do, you don't need this for oil-based clay, but for water-based clay it's very important. It's just a very thin steel wire with 2 pieces of wood, and you just cut your clay. To build the base where we're going to put the sculpture, we're going to take about a 1-inch slab of this, and we're just going to simply try and make it nice and even, and just kind of slice it backwards. Pick it up. This is when you have your water bottle and you put plenty here. So this plastic bag should be stretched out a little bit better, but we're going to add a little bit more clay, and we're going to take our paint scraper like this, and I'm just going to cut a slab, the additional like chunk of clay. So if you move it around, you're going to have to push it down a lot with your weight. That's going to spread it out. Then you're going to have to push it back in. But this clay is definitely getting a little bit too hard. It would help to have clay that's a little wetter. Make sure that you take care not to leave any cracks in the clay. And make sure you get it nice and wet. I'm going to take some of my water bottle. I'm just going to spray it. So just going to take our tool here, and we're just going to roughly create a 1-inch base, because you need this base in order to start building the sculpture on. If you don't have this, then there's no way to attach the sculpture. I think that might be the case here. So I'm just going to add a little bit more of the soft clay on the sides and try to look at the imperfections of this base. It helps to have a very flat base. Usually I won't move on unless this base is fully done. In the way I see it, a lot of her weight is right here and her thighs are this way. She has her hand on the base as well, and it's just her fingers. So if I'm looking at her, this is the front right here, and this is the back. Put a B. She's sitting on her legs, so both her thighs are this way. It definitely helps to have a fresh bag of clay. Cut like a slab of this clay, and it's kind of thick. I'm going to take this onto, and this is the rear, this is the front. So what I'm going to do is cut this in half like this. This is just a way of starting your clay really fast. And you know, I left my clay outside and I can feel the ice. So her torso is right about here. And if I make it a little bit even thinner, like this, should be able to, so if I turn it this way, you should be able that, you want to create this kind of S-curve. Remember, there's going to be the torso here and then the pelvis here. But we're trying to create something really quickly for the pose. So I'm just going to take this and I'm just going to put it down where I want her torso to be, which is going to be the mass. The mass of her body is going to be this. And if I turn it this way, it looks very, very flat. But she's actually kind of sitting this way. But I want this to kind of attach itself to the base. And then eventually, I'm going to sculpt everything together. It's actually going to be kind of coming up even more. So I can kind of push, just by pushing it like this, it'll kind of come up. And it's very flimsy, as you can see. So we need to create the thighs now. Her thighs are going to be this way. I'm going to cut them like this, like that. Just going to open those. That's one thigh. And now I'm going to take this. Remember, this doesn't have to be perfect at all. It's all about just massing in the look of her thighs. So that's the other thigh. And now at this point, I have the two thighs. I'm going to put one here. Make sure that all of this is really wet. And you need to really push it onto the very bottom. So take your weight and put it on top of that thigh and just kind of push it down. Push it towards the torso here. So this is the torso and this is the leg. So just by doing this, it's a lot faster than taking like little bits, especially when you're struggling with clay that's a little bit too dry. And that's what I have in one bag, is just very dry clay that makes it very difficult to do things. So that's one leg. It's actually going to come up a little bit more. And I'm going to attach this. Make sure you get this. And just really attach it to this part. You really have to push in the clay so it adheres. If you don't attach it properly to the other clay, then you're going to have issues later when they dry because they're not bonded. And most of the time, if you just stick with clay that comes from the same bag and it's fresh clay, you'll never have to worry about this. The only reason I'm worried about this is because I'm using different clay that I've used for different projects. So we need to build up the thighs at this point. This is when you can use some older clay. I'm going to do that because I need a fresh clay just to get all of this done. The very bottom, and then the thighs actually kind of curve this way. So that means that we're going to have to bring the thighs and they're much wider. That's the belly button here. And then there's the linea alba, which is a line going down the abdominals. And that's the very bottom of the breast. Then you have your rib cage shape, and it should come up to here. And then we're going to build our neck. You can indicate the neck right away because we want to kind of figure out. Usually I don't put the heads right away because I am waiting for things to dry, but because this sculpture is fairly easy to do when it's as a straight shot, we can go ahead and do that. One of the things that you have to keep in mind is that when you are sculpting something that's freestanding in water-based clay, what happens is that the clay is very wet and it's going to be sinking down. So as it's sinking down, you have to constantly be pushing up if you don't want it to come down because it doesn't have an interior armature. So this clay, it's like varying sort of thicknesses, but you should try and do all the pieces, including indicate where the arms are, even if they're not completely great, and keep it very general. So I'm going to use this aluminum tool to kind of smooth things out and remove imperfections. But this is the general sculpture that I'm trying to do. It's a little flat here in the back, so I need to add a little bit more clay. You have to definitely not concentrate too much on adding weight up top, because if you add too much weight up top, it's going to start decreasing and going down. So it is a little bit of a balance game in the beginning because tomorrow, when I start working on this sculpture again, it's going to be firmer. So essentially, you are creating an armature inside. You want it to be a little bit undersized, so that is a little bit on the thinner side. But after this hardens up, it's going to be much easier to add the rest of the sculpture. So this is the head. It's very flat, but I also don't want to add any weight. There is another way of fixing this by just taking like a few sticks and kind of skewering the sculpture right through the head. You've seen me do that for various sculptures, and that works out very well for terracotta. This is a little bit hard to get inside of the thighs, so you're going to have to use a different tool, but keep it really simple like this. And at this point, this is when you can really kind of like move the sculpture around. So if you want to exaggerate a little bit of the sculpture, you can do it. So right over here, I'm going to push this up because I know it's going to be sinking in, and I'm going to twist this. That's going to give it a little bit more of a dynamic sort of thing. And also, if I move, and you see I have my reference up here, and I can just move it along. So I'm not even thinking about attaching this hand yet to the platform. It does seem like I'm missing a little bit of the platform. So eventually you want to add a little bit of clay. But I am putting these little pegs from the arm to the body because this is going to dry very hard. This is going to become much harder and very quickly than the body. And what you want to do is kind of like keep everything in the same consistency because we're going to have to rework it. We probably are going to have to remove the arm and redo it. This tool is really good because I can pretty much work on this size of sculpture using this. And it is not a difficult tool to use just as your main tool. So the head is moving a little bit too much. Using this tool, I can draw in where I think things are going to be. So try to look at the sternum, draw a line straight down, and that means that this part is going to be kind of pushed off to the side. So using the back side of this tool, you can kind of push things around. That is the difficult part about making details right away, is that you eventually are going to remove a lot of these details. So that's the arm. So at this point, we're just drawing with our tools. So here's the sternocleidomastoid, and it's very good. Because she's turning her head, that's very prominent. But here's a clavicle here, clavicle here. Ask yourself which shoulder is higher, and I think it's my left one. So I'm just gonna add a little bit to my shoulder here. And you see, I can just twist this tool, and that's going to blend the clay together. Right about here is the rib cage. We don't have to worry too much about the shape of it just yet. Just kind of cut it. And this is the abdominal. On females, it's a lot harder to see the abdominal because it's usually covered with fat. You know, at a certain point with sculpture, you do have to kind of stop sculpting because you want the clay to harden a bit, because this is our armature. Turn the sculpture. This arm is actually going to be coming out much more. There's a negative shaping between the arm, but I don't want to do that just yet because I want it to stay a little bit wetter. We're going to add a little bit more clay, and I believe her thighs are a little bit closer together. So I could just take one of these tools, kind of just push everything a little bit. Let's indicate where that thigh is and where the leg is. Where her thigh is sitting on her leg, it's going to widen out this thigh because the fat is kind of pushed out. And I think that area actually looks pretty good. So let's keep rotating. So it is starting to have some shape to it. I think our main goal right now is just to get the proportion. So it's falling back a little bit too much. I'm going to push it forward. Let's move this arm. And she's kind of looking back a little bit. I'm going to add a little bit more mass to that upper arm. Let's just sculpt a little bit more towards the bottom of the arm. The upper arm should be And you know, this is one of the really good tools for this, is keeping things flat but detailed at the same time. That way you know the direction that the light is coming in. So the acromion process is here, trapezius, and the head's going to be wider. She's also looking. So I had her head lean just a little bit too much. So kind of push this in. So at this point, the humerus is right about here, and the arm comes this way. So we can start twisting it. Make sure you create a nice 90-degree angle here. So the arm actually kind of attaches to the front. So make sure you push all of this together. The clay should join the figure. Bring it back, right about here, to the front. The wrist is actually at the thigh here, and then the arm kind of comes out. But we're not going to worry about that because we're probably going to have to redo this. And I'm going to add a little bit of clay here just so it becomes a little bit more secure. Her fingers, this is going to be very difficult to draw or sculpt her fingers just touching this. So that's going to be a very difficult part. And let's add to the back. So the back is definitely kind of wimpy. Her trapezius and her back are much wider or much thicker. We should add a little bit more. I'm going to twist the model. Her scapula comes out a little bit more. So this clay is simply much too hard. If your clay is getting too hard, spray it with water. And so far, we have, her hair is actually going to be covering most of this, but we're still going to sculpt it without the hair first, because I want to make sure that we build out enough of the upper back, because we have the scapula here, and it doesn't seem like she even has a scapula in my sculpture. That's the problem with sculpting details too fast, is that often we forget the more important things underneath. Clay. The clay is definitely way too hard. Because if we leave it, we want to be able to join new clay onto here, and if it's too rough and too separated, the new clay that we add might not be able to adhere. So with this, I have my armature, and I'm pretty much finished for today. It definitely needs a lot more work, but my clay is just way too dry. It's one of the issues that I'm having is that my clay bag was a little bit open, and it got the clay just a little bit too hard for my liking. So to get this ready for tomorrow, we're gonna have to cover it. And you should have a plastic bag like this, and all you have to do is, for water-based clay, put a bag like this so it doesn't dry too much. And this way, it's going to keep the clay nice and wet. One thing that you could do, if you want it to be a little bit drier, you could just kind of lift it up and let some air into the clay. Some people put stuff on top. Some people tuck the plastic underneath the platform. You don't need to do that because remember, this clay is too dry, but I want it to stiffen up a little bit. What I want to do is spray plenty of water into my bag because I want this clay to be much wetter than what I have it. All you do is twist it and put it like this, and it should keep its moisture.